Hello, I hope everybody had a great weekend. I am going to be talking about this week's module, which is prehistory. And sadly, nobody could make it live to join me, so it's just going to be myself, which means that whatever humor I think I might have will be wasted entirely on myself. Hope everybody had a good week since the last time we talked. The last thing you saw the video that we did. There were a couple of things that I wanted to mention. A couple of questions about rubrics, a couple of questions about differences between uh, submission and assignment description sometimes. Uh, Professor Assel has put together a series of modules that he hopes to kind of standardize the Introduction to Art program, and I asked to be a beta tester. Then we also adapted this in-class instruction to online instruction. And so there's going to be some things. I try to catch everything. I try to edit all the issues out, but there's going to be some things that are going to be a little bit different every once in a while, where I've made a mistake in not carrying forward the transition to online teaching throughout all the materials. Um, there's been a few students who have pointed that out to me, and I really appreciate that because that helps me to go in and find out what I need to fix. And you may have noticed that I have fixed a couple of the rubrics, a couple of the assignment descriptions. Also notice there's a couple items missing because we aren't having live discussions with students. And so two things. One is I appreciate your patience, but the other is I really appreciate it when you point something out and say, hey, this doesn't seem to match up with the description. One example is the collage and drawing. You're required to do 5 collages and then draw one of them. But in the rubric, it said you draw uh, your own, one of your own collages, and then somebody else's in the classroom. And since we don't meet in the classroom, I had to take that out of the rubric after a couple people had already turned it in and mentioned it to me. So if there's any concerns, anything like that, again, feel free to uh, resubmit something and let me know you resubmitted it so we can take care of it. Another issue was for the studio portion of this particular module, you're required to work with 3 different colors of acrylic, and there's a call for 5 different line paintings. With this, you can take the 3 different colors and you can do one painting with just using one of each of the colors. You can do the lines with one color and then do another set of lines over it with another color. You can do parallel lines with 3 different colors. You can do whatever you want with the color use. However, I would recommend doing at least one of the 5 paintings with just each of the colors alone. So you would have one painting with just black, one painting with just red, and one painting with just the yellow. And then the other 2, you can mix it up and do whatever you want, following the directions to drawing or painting the lines and all that. I hope that kind of makes a little bit of sense. If you have any questions about that after going through the material, let me know and we'll try to work that out. I am, it is kind of sad that nobody was able to make tonight on the live meeting. A couple people asked me how to get on, and everybody's name should be on the team for this Teams meeting. So you should be getting a notification through Canvas. If you aren't getting a notification, please, after you watch this video, contact tech support for Canvas and see what's going on, because I've done everything that I'm supposed to be doing. And most people are who have been getting on haven't had any problems with that, as far as I understand. If there is a problem and you're not getting notified, let me know and check out tech support and talk to tech support, because there's nothing more than I can do from my end. I do know that there's a new security set protocol going into effect over this week and the next couple weeks. I was having some issues with that. It was user error, it's my fault. But so if there are problems with Canvas and things like that, Canvas tech support is going to be your best bet. And since we are testing the system regarding modules and descriptions of assignments and things like that, if there are any discrepancies, please again, let me know. Now this module, we're talking about prehistory. Primarily, we're talking about the time before written language. And we're talking about mostly cave paintings and then Polynesian artwork or Polynesian perspective. I want to ask how old or what is prehistory? How old do you think people are? And how long have we had history? I think it was Winston Churchill that said history is written by the victors. I would also say that history is written by the publicists. Mostly how we identify history is evident events or facts that are recorded through some sort of verbal or written history. I'm sorry, verbal or written literature, a record of some sort. Now, human beings, we've been around on this planet for an awful long time. Modern humans, from the last things that I've read, there might be a fourth group, but from the last thing I've read, we are the result of three groups of proto-humans coming together. The Denisovans, rather large pre-humans who had evidently lots and lots of teeth, but they're averaged maybe a foot taller than people do now. They were called Denisovans because they were discovered in the Russian mountains and verified as one of our ancestors within the last 15, 20 years. Then the other two groups you've probably already heard of, the Cro-Magnon, which were more like what we think of ourselves today, and the Neanderthal, which were averaged maybe a little bit shorter. And the Human Genome Project said that maybe that's where we get red hair from, our Neanderthal ancestors. There is this idea that they fought each other until the weakest groups died out, but the reality is we have their DNA in our bodies, so evidently enough of them got along to make us. So they are our ancestors. And humans, like what we would recognize humans to be, Homo sapiens, have been around for, depending on who you ask, anywhere from 80 to 200,000 years. There's a couple of scientists that think that we've been around even longer than that. But during all that time, we know that humans like us has been around that long because they've left markers, like tools, occasional artwork, occasional things that look like they definitely did something conscious to change the physical material that they interacted with. Shelters, things like that. But the reason why that is not considered history, even though they do record something of our ancestors, is because it's not written down, it's not clarified, or it's not any part of a traditional verbal literature. I include that as well because, well, I'll mention that a little bit later. But the oldest language, if you guys went and as you look through the module, you realize that the oldest written language that's surviving into today is out of Iraq or Mesopotamia. And that is maybe 5,400 years old. So 3,400 years before BC is when that oldest language started being recorded. And there's, what interests me is that the oldest language is rarely dry history stuff. It includes things like the time spans of the reigns of the rulers, the kings generally. It includes stories of how human beings interacted with gods or creators figures. And it includes, which I think is kind of funny, it includes how many bales of hay were sold to people. So the oldest writing is accounting records plus mythology and royal lineage records. There's not an awful lot of stuff about who got married to who, unless it was royal, uh, where people are moving to, what the political scandals of the day were, things like that. There's not an awful lot of that from that far back, but those three things really seem to be front and center for language. Then coming forward just a little bit, in Egypt, about 3200 BC is when the first language shows up in Egypt. I don't know if you guys ever saw Mummy and Mummy Returns, a little over 20 years old, with Brandon Fraser and The Rock making a famous appearance as the big monster in Mummy Returns. He was called the Scorpion King in the mythology of the movies. What's fascinating, I was watching a program about basically the birth of Egyptian civilization. And they said that the nickname given to the king who established a written language so that people from one end of the kingdom to the other could actually correspond with each other and communicate with each other and start keeping records. His nickname was the Scorpion King. So, in one sense, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was responsible for bringing language to Egypt. Moving forward a couple thousand years, 1300 BC, we have the Shang Dynasty in China, where records were kept. And then 900 to 600 BC, in Mesoamerica, the Maya were among the oldest to have written language. And these are what is difference between people making images and making a record of themselves that way, and then having a language, is that written language is identifiable as a system of symbols that either represent sounds or ideas that can be put together in such a way so that somebody else completely removed from the issues at hand, if they know the language, they know what happened. And that is when history starts being developed. Now, I also talk about verbal history. A lot of what we know about the Mali Kingdom and the original Lion King, Sundiata, came from the griots, who were the verbal history keepers. I know most of you in high school had to read Iliad and Odyssey. Those were written by Homer, when actually they were sung by Homer, and bards throughout Greece would keep those stories alive by memorizing all of those books, and singing them to people. And that's how that knowledge was passed around. It's called verbal literature. And we think, oh, that's impossible. But I know 7 and 8-year-old kids today who have memorized the Quran. So it's not impossible. And other people I know who've memorized books like the Bible and other works. What is fascinating to me too is that this verbal history can go back a long ways. There was a study done about 25 years ago where an anthropologist went to Australia, started making friends with several of these really deep in their lore Aboriginal nations, and was able to find that there were verbal accounts that had been passed through the generations of astronomical events that happened over 50,000 years ago. So this is real stuff. But the reason why we're looking at prehistory is that there seems to be something that people felt, our ancestors felt, was important enough that even though they didn't have a language that they shared, they wanted to record it anyway. And there's 4 different cave systems that we talk about in the module. 2 in France, 1 in Indonesia, 1 in Argentina, 1 in South Africa. They have some very similar things going on, which is really interesting. And I included a little bit about from Dr. Genevieve von Petzinger, who doesn't say that this is a language, but she noticed that our ancestors in the remote past, when they did their cave paintings, chose to use symbolic representation that seemed in context to represent the same thing. Now, we can't identify specific events outside of astronomical events, and there has been some evidence that they recorded that. But because of that, this is known as prehistory. If we look a little bit around the world, now I should back up a little bit. Prehistory is pretty much anything before that 3000 BC where the only way of passing the knowledge down was by one person teaching another person, and with no permanent record keeping. Uh, Even though there was that verbal literary tradition, uh, a lot of that was consistent specifically, it was tied specifically to the immediate needs of the cultures that use those kinds of traditions, with the exceptions being what I mentioned, like um, the bards in Greece, the bards in Northern Europe, the wisdom keepers that you see in a lot of shamanistic cultures, and the griots, particularly the griots in Mali. There's lots of other examples, but until a lot of that gets recorded in a permanent fashion, it's still considered prehistory. Just like the Iliad and the Odyssey were considered songs until somebody was able to write them down. They still are songs, but now we have them as a portion of our literary history. If we move over a bit, Polynesia, the Pacific Ocean is the the most expansive body of water on the planet. And what is fascinating is that every island there that is big enough to sustain a human population is inhabited and was inhabited at least 500 years ago or earlier. And there's traditions where talking about people that were way that inhabited these tiny islands way before that. I was about 20 years ago, actually closer to about 15 years ago, I was working at BYU and got to meet with a group of people that were New Zealand artists that were all Maori. They were native Maoris, and speaking with them, that was a question that I had about how could people be so daring and reckless to go nowhere and somehow find islands. And one thing I was told by an elder was that floating in the middle of the body of water, somebody who knew what they were doing could lay on their back and feel the water underneath them and start to map out where the land was, hundreds of feet below them, and find their way to an island. And I thought that is somewhat mystical and amazing. But in this module, we talk about a Dr. Wade Davis who heard that kind of thing and started examining things really closely, started asking these wisdom keepers how they did it. And he found that these people were so in tune to the natural world around them without anything other than verbal record keeping. They were able to identify exactly what species of plants would be in the water uh, at different distances away from landfall, what kind of birds would be in the water, in the air, how things would smell. Even if you couldn't sight land, the air would change and you could smell things differently. The water would be a slightly different color. They were also incredibly aware of how to navigate through the celestial bodies, through the stars, through the moon, through the evidence of airflow in the upper atmosphere and the sun, and just all sorts of things. And this was astonishing just because of the depth of knowledge that people were able to pass verbally from one person to another down through the ages. And so, Easter Island is, I think, considered the most remote inhabited uh, land in the world. And I believe belongs to the country of Chile. But the people there speak Rapa Nui, which is one of the tiniest living languages with the fewest number of speakers. But when people lost at sea doing the whaling and things like that would find landfall, most of the time, if the island was big enough to sustain a human population, there were people already there. I think that just is amazing. And we can see a lot of this awareness of the natural world and an importance of storytelling and wisdom keeping in their art, where the art may not specifically identify calendar events, but it does talk about, it does share ideas and the things that are important within the cultures that are involved. For the assignment, the studio assignment, we're gonna write a reflection or two about these kinds of things after you go through those sections of the module. But for the assignment, what we're working with is the idea of line. And our ancestors did use color. They weren't colorless people. I think we see these stone busts from Roman and Greek times in museums, and we think that they only carved in marble and left it the natural color. The reason why they're the natural color is because over the centuries, all the paint has been rubbed off. One of the black African emperors of Rome was named Severus. His portrait bust is in London, and the reason they knew where he was from, or were able to, they knew where he was from because of the historical record, but the reason they were able to validate it was because they found microscopic flecks of paint on his bust, because people would paint that to reflect what the emperor may have actually looked like, which I think is really interesting. Of course, you move forward from Greek and Roman times into Renaissance, and by that time, all the paint was already worn off. And so you get these incredible artists like Michelangelo, Botticelli, who would sculpt in stone, and they would just use the pure stone and not color it, because they assume that that's what their ancestors had done. And thinking about that, I'm thinking that our ancestors of 35,000 years ago, who did those cave paintings that we're looking at in this module, I think that they were very aware of other colors. And there is some evidence to show that they used other colors. Tattooing on Ice Age mummies was done in black and blue inks. People at the same or similar cultural level around the world still use black and blue ink. So blue is one color that we don't readily see a lot. But if you look at the cave paintings and see what the colors that they primarily use, the black, the red, and the yellow, it is usually pigments that are smashed from things that aren't going to change color over time. They're also in caves, so they don't have to worry about being light fast. But I think that they were picked specifically because of their longevity. So the ochre that was used, the ferrous oxide that was used, and the ash that was used, I think were picked specifically because of their pigment longevity. And for this assignment, those are the three colors you're going to be working with. You're going to need to do 5 different images. After looking at these cave images or cave painting images, feel free to look on the internet, look up more images like that. I would even recommend looking up something like Jackson Pollock, what he did. But be particularly aware of the quality of line. If you remember, we defined line in a couple different ways. We are not going to use the term shortest distance between 2 points. It's mathematical. For art, a line is any mark that you make between a starting and a stopping point. And one of my favorite definitions is a line is a point that went for a walk. But another good definition is a line is a mark that is significantly longer than it is wide. So look at the examples given in the studio assignment. Use your brush, and what I would recommend, you have 3 different colors. So maybe do a painting with several different lines of one color, then do a second one with several different lines of your next color, and then do your third painting with several different lines of your third color. Pay attention to those ideas of repetition and rhythm, building up some sort of a rhythm, and then playing with that rhythm a little bit, and playing with that repetition to add interest to the piece. If you look at the rubric, you'll see what the important points are for this assignment. Spending, I believe, 15 minutes on each of the paintings is really important. And then after you do one painting each of those 3 colors, then maybe do a painting with yellow lines, let that dry, then do red lines over it. Or maybe do a painting where the lines alternate. If you look at Native Australian art, Aboriginal art, there is some really cool stuff that Australian artists are doing today, uh, playing with those kinds of ideas. They add white to the mix, but they are basically those simple colors for the most part in a lot of these traditional and classical Aboriginal painting. But think about those things, and if you get bored with just one color, after it dries, add a second color and play with it. Um, Look at the assignment, like I said, look at the examples shown, but also look at the cave art that you've seen and see if you can mimic or at least honor some of the line quality that you see in those cave imagery. There's also some really beautiful stuff that we see in petroglyphs or rock art, particularly in Utah and Arizona. There's some astounding stuff, and you could look at that too. See if you can mimic some of the line quality there. Growing up, I had Navajo brothers and a Shoshone sister, and so we would go to some of these sites, and they would share with me some of the insights that they had about this imagery that we would see that they felt that their ancestors had been responsible for. And I thought that was very cool, being a little kid and hearing those kinds of things. If you have any questions about this after you go through the module, remember that we can't turn in the assignments until everything is done sequentially in the module, which means you open each thing and you can either scan it or read it. I prefer if you read it, but you can scan it and at least get to the next spot because it opens up in order. And then after you go through everything, then you can get to the assignments. So if you can't open an assignment, it's almost always because things need to be opened up beforehand. Now, I mentioned a week or two ago, we talked about the list of artists, and everybody was responsible for writing down, looking up 20 different artists and writing down their names, the title of the work, and then a very short description. And then everybody was responsible for picking an artist and writing a short bit about why they chose that artist. I'm going to add, I believe, to this next module, just a short bit where I'll need you to look up that artist and find maybe 5 or 8 resources, like videos on them or articles on them. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means to do this kind of research. And then what you'll need to do is just submit the links and keep them, because then the next week after that, I'll have you do an annotated bibliography about a few of those that you select, a few of those links that you selected, and we'll talk more about that over the next week. Yeah, during our next meeting together. And then there's a couple other elements of that research project. But also, we are going to be revisiting the continent of Africa. I don't know if anybody knows how many countries are in Africa. I'm embarrassed that I thought it was 52, but I can't remember. And in that, we'll get to revisit our friends in Mali. And one of the projects that we'll have before the end of the semester is you'll use materials that you have at home to make something that needed to belong in the Mali kingdom, but wasn't there. Something that we use every day today that they could have definitely used back then. Don't worry about that now. That's just to keep in the back of your head about what kinds of things you could do. And we'll talk about more of this stuff next week. For now, do your best to follow the assignments, read everything in sequence so you get the information that you need by the time you get to the assignment. And again, if you come across a difference in the rubric or the assignment description and how you turned it in, let me know so we can sort that out. I'm going to try to get everything graded and up to date over the next week or so, so everybody knows where they stand, and we'll move forwards from there. So between now and when we next talk to each other, I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Again, if you have any questions, email me and let me know. And I will see you soon.